My guest today is New York Times bestselling author Clare Leslie Hall. Her novel, Broken Country, was also a Reese's Book Club pick earlier this year. Today, we talk about what stories draw Clare's attention, the importance of Backlist and how those books can come back to surprise you, pen names and their purpose in publishing, how she harnesses ideas once they appear, blending genres, romantic suspense, courtroom drama, and domestic noir, writing class tension without slipping into cliche, the storytelling advice that completely changed the way she thinks about research and writing, and so much more. Creative Inspired Happy is a video podcast featuring interviews with the biggest names in books, as well as rising literary stars, about what made them fall in love with stories, why they write, their biggest successes and disappointments, and of course, their latest books. All hosted by me, New York Times bestselling author Evelyn Skye. Join our warm community for free to get behind-the-scenes insights about author life, book recommendations, the opportunity to ask questions of upcoming podcast guests, and more. Just go to creativeinspiredhappy.com or follow the link in the episode notes. I hope you enjoy the show. Hi, Clare. Welcome to Creative Inspired Happy. How are you doing today?
I'm very good. Thank you very much for having me, Evelyn. I'm excited to chat to you.
Oh, we're going to have such a great conversation. I have so many things I want to ask you, and our community was really excited as well when I told them that you were coming on the show. So I'll have some questions for you from them a little later on. But I want to start before we talk about your writing. I'd love to know about you as a reader and what your reading habits are and what kind of stories draw you in, either beginning from childhood. Have you always been a reader, or like what kind of books do you like reading now?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think my reading habits were formed as a child. I've got two older sisters. My parents were teachers, and I was an obsessive bookworm from the age of 6. And we used to go for the long summer holiday to Norfolk, and we sort of almost gamed the system, and we'd get out our maximum quota of books from 2 different libraries, and then we would go home and read, all of us, all 5 of us. And I feel that I still crave that absolute immersion. You know, when a book comes in and you get that amazing rush when you read the first page, you go, wow, this is going to be for me. One of the books that my mother gave me, it's quite an old book, was called I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith, who wrote 101 Dalmatians. And I absolutely fell passionately in love with that story. It's about two sisters living in a crumbling castle. And I now think that I read it again and again and again, and it's still my comfort read. And I think it probably formed what I love in a book. And I love family stories. I love love stories. I also I think I write sort of cross-genre fiction, which maybe we can talk about, but it wasn't my intention to do that. It's just that I love to write about emotion, and I love things that keep me turning the pages. And I loved The Great Gatsby, which is love and murder combined. I love The Secret History. So I think that those are my tastes. And when that comes along in a book, it absolutely blows me away.
I mean, I completely can see how that formed you as a writer based on what Broken Country is about, which we're going to talk a lot about. I think it's so interesting when we delve into who a writer was when they were a reader, because for me, I want to write the kinds of stories that I enjoy writing. And it's fascinating when I meet people who don't read the same genre that they write.
Yes, I know exactly what you mean. And I mean, I didn't think I've never really thought of myself as a thriller writer. And actually, my first 2 novels, which are going to be coming out in the US in autumn, which is very exciting, they in the UK were positioned when I got my first book deal, I think 7 years ago. They were both positioned as psychological thrillers. And I never felt right for me because they're similar. They're dark love stories with a strong element of suspense. And so I think what happened when I got to write Broken Country was that I was trying very hard to write myself away from thrillers. And in actual fact, it was quite a tough write. I had to have big gaps. The idea came very, very quickly. But then I had a big gap of about 6 months, and I suddenly understood how to do it. And the funny thing is I put a murder trial in it. So it's kind of more thrillery than any of my other books. And somehow that just worked.
Okay, so this is actually a perfect segue into our first question from our community. So, Creative Inspired Happy, it's not just a podcast, we're also an online community with a bunch of readers and writers. And so, Rebecca W. has a question for you, and she noticed that, as you mentioned, you had written other books in the UK, and that was under the name Claire Empson. And now in the US, Broken Country is your US debut, and you wrote it under Clare Leslie Hall. And so, why did you decide to change your name? And is it because you were talking about, the publishing a slightly different sort of story?
I think exactly that. I don't know if the market has changed. Maybe you would have some views on this, but when I went out on submission in 2017, I think as an author then you were told to stay in your lane. And I remember my agent saying this was a really tough book to position. And then when it came to Broken Country being going on submission in last year in 2024, it was funny because I'd written out of contract, and so I'd written and given it up at times when it was hard, and I'd written in a vacuum, as you do when you're out of contract. So the only person I knew that loved my book was my agent, and I had no idea what the reception would be. But I remember seeing some of the, and the responses were so amazing, and I remember seeing the heading that she put on her pitch email, and she said love story with the pulse of a thriller. So it was like she made a virtue of the fact it was cross genre, and that just seemed to really work. And I sort of, those are the books I've always loved to read, and I don't think you do have to stay in your lane.
So when you publish your previous two novels in the United States, when they're coming out, will they be under Claire Hall or will they be under Claire Empson?
They'll be under Clare Leslie Hall. And it's
Okay.
really exciting for me. We've changed the titles. They were called Him and Mine, and they had a deal in a few countries in Europe and particularly Germany and the UK. But what's really exciting, because they were very thrillery, the covers and even the titles, is that we've changed the titles. I've done a little edit on them, which is kind of quite strange. So, for example, the second book, I never really liked the ending. And I've changed it. So it's, I mean,
Wow.
whoever gets the chance to go back, you never do. And so that's, I much prefer it. I'm so happy with the ending. It's much more redemptive. It's much more probably in keeping with Broken Country. And it was very fascinating because they're coming out in America, and they've done beautiful covers that I love so, so much. And we've called them Pictures of Him, so reflecting the original Him title, and Days You Were Mine, reflecting the original Mine title. And it was fascinating for me going back and doing light edits on those books, because I think as a writer, you move on, and I hadn't read them for 6 years, and suddenly you see so much of yourself on the page that you weren't expecting to see. You understand your preoccupations when you were writing it. Does that make sense to you? So I sometimes think I didn't realize I was writing about my own grief in the first one, or until you go back and look.
Mm-hmm. Did anything embarrass you when you went back to read it, or are you just thinking, oh, this is past Claire and it's okay?
I actually really loved them. I will say that but I wanted to change this ending, which I felt was rushed and unfair on this character. So that I didn't feel embarrassed by them, but I did find them so sad. I think they're very emotional books, and actually, what was interesting, maybe it's because more of it was personal than I realised. So, for example, in the first book, I talk about this character's grief losing her mum, which was something that happened to me at university. And I think I was probably, it was in a way, it was a form of therapy having that thread. And the second book is about a birth mother reconnecting with her adopted son. And that was my husband's story. And I was reading it the other day. I was like, wow, I can't believe you let me do this. But it's not his story, but it was inspired by something that happened in his life. And the same with the first one. So I still love them. I think they're not dissimilar in a way tonally to Broken Country.
I think that's wonderful. I think it's so kind of you to your past self to still embrace and love her stories and still, I think, be able to change your genres, change your writing as you progress as well. So it's an appreciation of both past and present and then moving forward.
Yes, exactly. No, it has been. I am really happy with the books, and I'm so thrilled with the new covers. And I wrote part of the second book in a place called Southwold, which is this very beautiful seaside town, and that's part of the book. And what was kind of uncanny was that Simon and Schuster, my US publisher, sent me three covers, and then one that they liked and I liked was this street in Southwold with it's a sort of very moody sort of 1970s image with the lighthouse in the background. And I couldn't believe it because I went back and looked through my phone and I'd taken photographs of one of the characters' cottage in the same street. So that was
Oh my
just
God, in the
by
same street.
chance, same
Wow.
street. I was like, this is
Wow.
kind of meant to be. So it's very exciting actually that they're going to have a new audience, hopefully.
Well, I absolutely love this story about Backlist coming back after you've had a third book out. I think it's so common that us authors, we tend to think, as you said, we move on from a story. You think, okay, it's out in the world. We are told things, at least here in the US, that your book has a lifespan of 3 months. And then if it doesn't sell, then bookstores are going to send it back. And so people tend to discount Backlist. But it's actually very important to have a long portfolio of your career, and it's so great that your books get a second chance now and a new life, not only just in different countries, but new covers. And I've never heard of anyone getting to edit their book again. So that
I
is,
know.
oh, so, so
It's
amazing.
amazing. Yeah, it's really meant the world to me for those books to have a second chance. It's just so because it's also they're also having a second chance in the UK because
Mm.
my publisher's taken those on as well. So
Oh,
it's
great.
yeah,
So they'll be re
dream come
released in the
true.
UK.
They I think yesterday actually.
Oh my gosh.
They yeah, paperbacks. So it's
Oh,
very exciting.
congratulations.
I feel
Oh,
very lucky indeed.
that is very, very exciting. All right, I want to talk about Broken Country. So Reese's book club praised Broken Country as touching an essential human part. Tell us about the book for the viewers and listeners who have not had a chance yet to pick up Broken Country.
Sure. So Broken Country is about a really passionate love triangle that takes place over the 1950s and 60s and ends with a murder trial at a famous courthouse in London. And it's really the story of Beth, who's a young woman, and she's completely torn between two men and two very different lifestyles. And what happens when her first love, Gabriel, comes back and turns her life upside down. And really, the idea came to me, and this never happens, but in a literal thunderbolt of inspiration. We, my husband was out running. We live in a very old farmhouse, and he was out running in the fields behind our house with our youngest son's puppy. And it was lambing season. The dog ran into a field of sheep and the farmer threatened to shoot him, which did not happen. But it was so uncanny because within minutes of talking about it, I could see the farmer and his wife in their field of sheep. I could see a little boy running towards them looking for his lost dog. And I had the thought that the boy reminded them of the son that they'd recently lost. And I also thought there's going to be a physical, kind of very powerful attraction between the farmer's wife and the boy's father. So it was as if a love triangle dropped out of the sky. Q4 years of trying to write it wasn't as straightforward as I thought it was going to be.
Okay, talk to me about that. So this idea came to you, and it's always actually more interesting to me to understand what do you do with an idea once it appears, rather than the question that people like to ask, which is where do ideas come from? Like, how did you massage this idea then over your 4 years?
I think I had so that inciting incident is still there in the sheep field when Gabriel is introduced to um, Frank, the farmer husband, and Beth, and so suddenly these three main characters together with all their sort of grief and jealousy and attraction. So that was always the same, but things that changed. I think I've been thinking about this today. I think looking back in hindsight, which is a very powerful thing, I realised that I probably over researched farming because even though we live in the middle of a farm, I didn't know anything about farming. And those early drafts, A, they were contemporary. B, the men, so Frank and Gabriel had voices as well as Beth. And it, I had this. It's funny to think of really, but an animal rights theme. So I think I just gone down this rabbit hole of thinking that the rise of veganism, the rise of animal rights, that's a problem with farmers, and it just when I look back, it wasn't authentic enough.
Mm.
Plus, there were a lot of poems in the book, and I think again that was me trying to write my way out of psychological thrillers into maybe something that was a bit more literary. And when I look back on those drafts, there's some writing I really love in there, but it just wasn't quite landing. And what happened was, after 2.5 years, my agent said, "This book isn't quite right. Something's not working. I think you need to put it away." actually sort of almost throw it away and write another one. And I was devastated because Frank and Beth and Gabriel were so in my heart. And actually, it was a girlfriend whose house I'm in today. I remember I was writing this new book, and I liked it, but I didn't feel the same. And she said, "Why have you done that? Why have you given up this book that you love?" But I still carried on writing this new book, and I remember it so clearly. I was on holiday with my family, and I got up really early, and the opening came, and it was "The farmer is dead. The farmer is dead. Nobody knows, who killed him." I got that opening. I suddenly knew that it was a woman's story. It was a woman who is torn between two men. And I knew it needed to be period. And the reason for that was because I wanted to show the sort of class contrast between Beth and Gabriel. They're both very smart when they're teenagers. They're both very bookish. And they both apply to Oxford. They both get in. But, Beth's life is knocked off course because she's a working class girl. And in Britain in 1955, particularly in the country, it was such a time of class and gender divide. And suddenly all those pieces fell into place. And I now think, as a writer, that for me, the biggest challenge is stepping away when something isn't working. I've just started a new book, and on Wednesday, it was one of my, because obviously it's quite hard to juggle promotion and writing. And last time I wrote out of contract, so I had this joyous time when I could spend 10 hours a day in my office if I wanted to. And so I'm finding that quite a hard balancing act. But I don't know. I just just really, really needed to learn. Like yesterday, Wednesday, I struggled with this chapter, and I ended up deleting, and I felt quite depressed when I was walking the dog. I'm like, oh, what a day! It's your day, and all you've done is delete. But then I remember walking the dog, and I was thinking, actually, that how this goes. It was only 2 years ago that you were doing your first draft, and what happens is you'll have a good day tomorrow or the day after. And of course, that is what happened. I rewrote the chapter. It's working. Move on. But I think it's quite hard to trust the process even now. Do you find that?
Oh, absolutely. Even if you've done it many times, when you
Yeah.
have one of those days, you just think, "Oh, this book." And I think I've gone through that same feeling with that you've had with Broken Country, where at some point an agent or an editor says this is not working, and they think that there's no way through, and you have to decide, do I set it aside or not? Do I keep working on it? And that's a really hard choice to make. And I feel like there's not necessarily a right answer. It comes down, for
Yeah.
me at least, it's intuition, which is the impossible answer that, doesn't help anybody else out there.
I completely agree. And I think about it a lot because the question I ask myself is, when should you give up? And I didn't feel relief. I felt quite sad. So there's
Mm.
that. But I didn't know if it was going to work out. And I think, like you say, you just have to go with your gut. And I took quite a few risks going back to Broken Country when I'd been advised not to. And it had been rejected actually by my previous publisher, who'd said it's not commercial enough. So it was a risk that I took, and I'm so glad that I did. But there was a lot of self doubt in there as well because I thought, gosh, I'm really sticking my neck out here. Have I done the right thing? And I guess the only way is if you're in your heart, you're unhappy leaving it, and that's what I felt.
Oh, that's a great touchstone for that. Can you talk a little bit about writing out of contract or when you're not under contract and how that is different? Because you took these risks with Broken Country. You didn't have a book deal signed up for this book. You
Yeah.
never knew if it would become a thing. And then now I assume this next book you're writing, you are under contract.
I'm not under contract yet, actually.
Oh, wow. Well, they better get on that.
So so but so there's no immediate time pressure, but I think I've learned a lot from I'm writing and I'm enjoying writing, and my agent is very good at sort of encouraging me because I had a big break, obviously all the promotion, etc. But I had a big break, and I had an idea, and I just couldn't quite get it, and then a missing piece fell in, and that's how it worked for me. But the writing out of contract, I absolutely loved it. Having said that, there was some despair in there because I was in a WhatsApp group with a lot of other authors, and they're once a year, a book a year authors, and I just feel like, gosh, who am I as I write my 19th draft? And I felt quite low about it, but the last few drafts when I knew I had it and I knew that my agent loved it, that was just what it's all about for me. I felt so immersed, and finally it worked. And in a way, I was free because it took 4 years with gaps. I was free to explore things, and of course, some of those things took me down the wrong rabbit hole. But I think, allowed me to write maybe a deeper book,
Mm.
and to get the emotional resonance right. And something I did with Broken Country, which I've never done before, but I remember I was writing in a cafe and it was too noisy, so I had my headphones in, and I heard this track, and it's by Oliver Arnold, so I could only listen to instrumental music, and it was called Happiness Does Not Wait. And I just thought, oh my goodness, it's Gabriel and Beth by the lake at the early stages, and I listened to it over and over and over again, and then I never listened to it again when I was writing, but on every single car journey, every single dog walk, I would listen to that and a few other tracks, and I think it really helped me stay with Beth's character and with the sort of tone of the book. So I would so recommend that if you can find the right music. I think it helps you stay with your characters in all the in between times, and I think my subconscious was kind of hanging out with Beth a lot.
Oh, I love that. Okay, Taylor from our community has a question for you. And Taylor says, I would love to know how you reimagine classic tropes to turn them into something new and exciting. Broken Country contains a love triangle, it's childhood friends to lovers, and these are tropes that we know well, but how did you make them fresh and interesting?
Yeah, it's so hard for me to answer that question. I can say to you that there were two books that really influenced me. One was Atonement by Ian McEwan, and
Mm.
the other was a very English novel called The Go Between by L.P. Hartley. And I think I don't ever think of any of it as being tropes. I know that I just felt of it. I think of it as being the story. I think I have it. It was quite easy for me because I mean, as well as very hard, but it was quite easy for me because I Beth came into my head, and I knew who she was. I knew she was a mother that was shut down by loss, and that every single decision she took was because she was yearning. She was yearning for Gabriel. She was yearning for her past life. She was yearning for who she was before her life went so wrong. And so that made it very easy. And I know it is a trope in the sense it's a first love story coming back, but I didn't really see it that way. I saw that I was very interested in nostalgia, and I saw that Gabriel comes back at a really difficult time of turmoil for Beth when she's at a crossroads because her husband Frank isn't giving her the space to grieve, and that's because he's so shut down by guilt himself. And I felt it was really interesting to explore that. It's like how much of it of her yearning was nostalgia for what she was
Mm.
before. So I guess my answer is I don't really see the tropes. I just saw the story, and I always focus on emotion. My son calls it the $1 million scene because I always say I have to have a big scene that I'm writing towards. And of course, the inciting incident where the in the sheep field was the big $1 million scene, and then I've got another one with the new book. And I think that I don't really think about tropes. I don't really think about other books other than the ones that influence me, like The Go Between or Atonement.
Okay, and so you mentioned writing cross genre, and this book, as you mentioned, it's got that romantic love. It's the love story. It's also a legal courtroom drama. There's so much deep emotion. There's delving into the internal life of a woman and what family means. How do you blend that all together? How do you balance the different elements?
I would say, I mean, just so many drafts. So what I had to begin with, well, to begin with, it was a contemporary story. But once I finally knew, 2.5 years in, this is how it's going to be. I knew it was period. I had 1955, that timeline, and I had 1968, and I wanted the reader to feel like Beth. So I wanted the reader to be completely swept up in the first love affair, and then find themselves slap bang in a new chapter with Frank, who's a very good man. So why wouldn't you love Frank? That's what I hope the reader feels. That's how I felt when I was writing it. And then later came the trial and the idea to do a murder trial, and it was funny because sometimes I think with writing, another thing I think I've learned is you have to be brave and take risks. And I think I took a risk writing a courtroom drama because I hadn't really even read very much. And I remember saying to my husband, this book should have a murder trial, but I don't know if I can do it. And I went and watched a murder trial, and it was absolutely incredible. It was in the Old Bailey, which is a famous old courthouse. And I just got so caught up. I watched it for a week. I got so caught up in the barristers and the whole case, and watching the defendant and feeling alternatively so sort of sorry for him, and then thinking, oh, he must be guilty. And it was all relying on the barristers. And I came home and wrote my own version of it. So that came late, and I think it amped up the suspense, which was brilliant. And it took the book in a very, very new direction. And I had some amazing advice. I consulted with a retired police detective who's now a crime author, and called Graham Bartlett. And I literally felt that I knew nothing about the legal world at all, but we had a few Zooms, and he read my pages. And the best thing he said was, because I was thinking, gosh, now the policeman's got to be on the witness stand. And he said, don't let real life get in the way of the story. Just put the drama first. And it just completely freed me up for it to be in Beth's head, sitting in the public gallery, watching the people that she loves. And it really changed everything for me. It's funny. It was a simple piece of advice, but it meant so much to hear it.
No, I think that's very helpful because, as you mentioned before, we can fall down the rabbit hole of research. And once you know a lot about a subject, it's really tempting to put it all into the book, almost to show off to the reader, like, look, I really know what I'm talking about, but it can be a disservice to the actual story.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, look, with the farmers, I went lambing. I went and stayed with a couple on a small holding, and was in a combine harvester. I learned how to milk cows, in a manner of speaking, and all that research is hardly in the book. But I think, and I think that is quite an important lesson, because you want to put it in, and I think that was what was going wrong at the beginning. What I realized over time was that research had given me the essence of who the farmers were as people, how connected they were to their landscape and their animals. And it kind of opened my own eyes, because I do live in a very sort of beautiful part of the world, but was probably a little bit guilty of rushing through life, rushing through with my dog walk, listening to my music. And actually, I see it very differently now. So that was all I needed to know, was the essence of the farmers. So I think it's quite easy to get sidetracked when you're researching.
Right. But I think, like you said, then that essence, it infuses itself in the characters that you're writing, even in a subconscious way sometimes.
Yes, I agree.
Okay, I want to go back to writing class tension because, as you mentioned, you have characters from different parts of life. How did you manage to do that without falling into cliche?
Yeah, that was sort of, again, I mean, I feel like I knew who Frank was. The most important thing for me with Frank was with the audio recording, that he wasn't positioned as having this very, very broad Dorset accent. I just see, he went to grammar school. I know his backstory. But he was just a man who was hardworking, who was obsessed with the land, and who opened. And Beth also is from a sort of working class background. Her parents work, and I knew exactly who they were. And with Gabriel, I just wanted to show the stark contrast. What was important for me there, to sort of avoid cliche perhaps, was to show why and how Beth and Gabriel connected. And they connect for passion, they connect for their love of books, that they're both incredibly romantic. She writes poems, he wants to be an author. And I think that just sort of bypasses all of the sort of cliche with those two. That's why they had this incredibly strong connection that neither of them could get over. And with Tessa Wolfe, Gabriel's mother, I had to sort of pull her back a bit, because it was quite easy. She's this sort of posh woman who's actually married into wealth, and I understood her motivations much more than I put in the book. but I had to sort of make her look, not, I wouldn't say likable, but less horrible than she was to begin with.
Oh, that's fascinating. And so I know that you mentioned that you knew some of these characters from the start, but then you also spent 4 years with them. You had to change the story so much. What is that evolution of the character for you like in terms of do you have to, I guess, adjust who they are as the plot changes when you throw in a courtroom drama? How does that affect your planning as an author?
I don't think I did actually. I mean, if you were to read the first draft, the contemporary draft, you just think it was almost a different book. There are some scenes that came across, but I don't think it. The characters, I just had a very strong sense of who they were, and even though Gabriel is, I pushed him back, and he wasn't a famous author. I think he was a playwright originally. Oh, and I had a whole Dickens thread, which was completely unnecessary, which I got very hooked and stuck on. And then I remember my agent saying, "Why have we got this Dickens thing?" And I said, "Oh, wow, we can get rid of Charles Dickens. Brilliant." But you sort of get stuck on things. So I think I knew exactly who they were. And even Jimmy, who had a different name at the beginning, he was called Billy. I knew that he was a reprobate, but a lovable rogue. I knew that he was closed down by losing his mum when he was 9, and I understood that. And I understood that what had happened was that he'd stopped caring about himself. And again, I had to bring him back a little bit because I wanted him to be likable. And obviously, there's the drinking and the occasional violence is very unlikable. So I had to show a more caring side with him, caring for the animals, particularly with Bobby, being a brilliant uncle with him. So I worked quite hard on things like that. And again, also with Beth, because Beth could be a very unlikable narrator. I mean, I love her, but I think she makes some bad choices, alienating choices in the course of the novel. But I also think I had to work very hard on when to reveal parts of her story so that I hoped that the reader would understand, if not why she makes those choices, or perhaps that they were forgivable, they would understand them. And I actually really sort of liked writing Beth because I feel like she's a survivor. Her life gets knocked off course quite a few times in the course of the novel. She has some very tough stuff thrown at her, but she always picks herself up, and I love the way she sort of doesn't end up with Gabriel at the beginning, and that's not what she expected, this very academic, amazing life. But she marries Frank, the farmer, and she throws herself instead into the wildlife and the landscape. And she realizes it's kind of like an education as well. And so, yeah, I would say I had to work pretty hard on making sure that those characters had resonance, particularly the ones who could be unlikable, like Tessa and Beth and Jimmy.
Well, I think you've absolutely succeeded, and I'm very excited for everyone who hasn't read Broken Country yet to pick it up. I have one last question for you, shifting gears a little bit about promoting a book and being part of Reese's book club and how that has changed your career. How is it different from your previous 2 books?
Oh, I mean, Evelyn, it is 100% different. It's been the most exciting thing. It's been like a dream come true, and something I never expected to happen. I mean, Reese herself is such a sort of wonderful, supportive person, and the whole book club, that whole community of authors are the same. So it's amazing to be involved with it. It was amazing to have the profile and for my book to then connect with US readers. All of these, I mean, it couldn't be more different. So, it's been an absolutely wonderful, wonderful experience. It really has. And I don't think it's changed who I am as a writer because I'm just still going to write the same stuff. I'm going to write emotional stories. But I am aware that the new book, I've got some of the things in which I think worked and people loved in Broken Country. So, yes, there's a love story. Yes, it's period. And yes, there's a murder. I don't know quite a few things like exactly who did it and why, but I've got some of the hallmarks of Broken Country. So maybe the experience has changed me in the sense that I'm a little bit more focused.
No, I love that. And so, just so that readers in the US know, when do your reissues come out here? Because I know you're still working on the next book.
Yeah, I think it's around October the 10th, about mid October, I think, so early autumn.
Oh,
So that's
fantastic.
incredibly exciting. And
That's
they are
quite
Clare
soon.
Leslie Hall and Days You and Mine and pictures of him.
Oh,
So yeah,
fantastic.
very
Oh,
exciting.
well, Claire, thank you so much for being on the show. This has been so fun. And I wish you the best of luck. If you're ever on tour in the US, in San Francisco, let me know and we will
I
have
most certainly
coffee.
will. Oh, thank you, Evelyn. I've so loved talking to you. Thanks for having me on.
And that's a wrap for today. For more stories and behind the scenes, visit creativeinspiredhappy.com. I'll see you all next time.